Well, a very good evening to you and welcome to a brand new episode of Biz First in Focus here on TV1. I'm Shahan Jurampati, your host for tonight's program. Well, it is certainly that time of the year for Sri Lanka. No, and I'm not talking about Christmas. I'm talking about the budget. Last week on Thursday, the 8th of November 2017, Finance Minister Mangala Samaravira presented the budget for the year 2018. And to discuss the good, the bad, and the implementation, most importantly, of the budget, we are talking to Shiran Fernando, the Chief Economist at the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Shiran, welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
Shiran, the budget has been titled Blue-Green Budget Enterprise Sri Lanka. Several say there are good proposals and some confusing proposals, more or less. What is your opinion on the budget this time?
If you look at it overall, I think the concepts, as you said, blue-green, and some of the other ideas that it's sort of bringing out, in a relative sense to what we've seen in the past, in particular the last 2 years, there is less confusion compared to the last 2 years. And the good thing, I think, overall is that the message is similar to what was being discussed prior by the government in terms of the overall Vision 2025, which goes beyond 2018, and the Prime Minister's speech because for 2017. Because in the past what you had was these vision documents, statements coming out, and then soon after the budget sort of taking 2 or 3 steps backwards in terms of setting the direction. So overall, I mean, as you said, there are certain sector impacts, certain sector implications, but I think relative to previous years, this is quite it's not as damaging, I would say, or minimal compared to what the uncertainty we've seen in the last few years.
On the stance of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, how do you all see the entire budget as a whole?
So we welcomed the budget in our statement as well, and what we've basically said is it looks good on paper. The proposals are forward-thinking, complements what they've been talking about. But as you started with the good, the bad, and the implementation, that's the key part. And while I think in his speech, as well as the Finance Minister has mentioned in forums after the budget was read out, that they're going to implement a implementation unit. As a chamber, we would want to see that actually operationalized. Open up channels even to consult the private sector, making sure that these proposals see the light of day and get action. Not only the revenue side, but even the expenditure proposals, because you sort of need, if you want to tick the tick boxes and achieve Vision 2025, some of the proposals here feed into that. So if you don't do it now, you're going to delay the whole thing. So we're overall welcoming the budget, but I think the real crux of the whole thing would be in sort of getting this implementation unit working, and for that to sort of, as the months go on, for that to be in open transparency. Because I think once that is sort of there, the government not only, I think, improves their credibility, as we've sort of mentioned in our statement, but also it reassures the public, the confidence of the private sector, and in particular investors, because now they would see, okay, you've seen the budget sort of complementing these things, okay, that's a good sign. Next is, are they implementing it? That'll be the next signal. So if the government's also able to give that signal, then it all goes well for 2018. But until that point comes, we have to hold them to account to that.
Shiran, you said the current budget looks good on paper. Well, anything looks massively impressive on paper. However, like we was talking all this time, implementation is key. Now, keeping that in mind, now I believe Rate Research has compiled a few data saying last year's budget, not much has been done. Only 3% more or less is on track or ahead of schedule, while 51% of the budget proposals where details are not available. Now this amounts to close to 67 billion rupees. So how confident are you that the proposals in this budget will be accomplished?
Well, if you look at even 2017, some of the proposals have come into 2018 as well. So clearly some of them are the right proposals, but need real implementation. On whether we are confident, I think we have to sort of give the benefit of the doubt to the new Minister of Finance, because he's recently only taken over. And if this unit sort of gets operationalized, and they sort of send the instructions to the line ministries and the others who are going to implement it, and that instructions or whatever is clear, and the whatever proposal gets implemented, then I think we'll be more confident. But I think until such a time we see a few of these getting implemented or being talked about, we really can't say. But that's why
it's a matter of keeping your fingers crossed, is it?
Not keeping fingers crossed, but I think even I think the expectation is not for all the proposals to be done, because if you look at some of these programs, they're going to run into 2019, 2020, some of them. So it's about some of them, I think, getting off the ground, if you were to put it in that way. Things like investment into education, health, things like that. You can't get that done working perfectly and the entire allocation spent in 2018. But if you see at least some action during the year, that improves that credibility once again, and we can be confident that we won't have to talk about this implementation again next year.
Well, do you think the government should up their game now, since we have an election in January, and now the government is, like you say, has proposed a very interesting budget on paper. So with an election at hand, do you think the government should up their game now, should be certain that they implement most of these proposals that they made?
Well, one thing I think even with the upcoming election, good thing that we did see from the budget is, yes, there were pre-concessions that they did give in September and even the day before the budget, but they didn't look to provide more concessions as they could have, or as they did probably in the interim budget in 2015. So that's something we should.
So this is more or less a realistic budget, we would say.
More or less a realistic, looking at even beyond 2018, if they sort of implement it. But I think it's difficult by January for them to be accountable for this budget, because there's just a month or so. But if you sort of see maybe things like the SME programs they're talking about, things getting off the ground, and at a grassroots level, activity sort of picking up, I think people will recognize that, oh, this may be because of the budget and what was talked about, but that has to happen.
Well, Shiran, we're going to cross over for a short commercial break. Stay with Biz First in Focus. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Biz First in Focus here on TV1, and we are joined by the Chief Economist at the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, Shiran Fernando. We're talking about Budget 2018, the good, bad, and most importantly, its implementation. Shiran, like we spoke before the break, the government has made some very interesting proposals, more or less now. The title of the budget itself is Blue-Green Budget rather, Enterprise Sri Lanka, which is more towards environmental protection. Having said that, the government has made very interesting proposals where they've all vehicles in the country will be powered by non-fossil fuel sources by 2040. How do you perceive this budget, this proposal?
So it's quite visionary in that sense, because even countries like India or I think UK, some of the European countries, Scandinavian countries have also said by 2040 they want to go into electric vehicles. So in that sense, we're sort of benchmarking ourselves there. So that's an overall good vision that's there. As I said before, I think this vision, you sort of need to see maybe the few things implemented in 2018, because this is not going to be something we're not going to overnight, or even over the next year, we're not going to turn into entire, electric green economy, as to say. But I think steps need to be taken, because if you look at even the electric side of it, it's great to go on that side, but you don't want fossil fuel to sort of power that electricity that's going to power the electric vehicles. So we need that long-term energy plan worked out. We need to move towards more renewable energy, so that you're complementing this move to electric vehicles with renewable energy sources, non-fossil fuel sources powering it. Otherwise, it would be quite, it would defeat the purpose of this whole intention. So those realistic steps need to happen next year and in the coming years for this overall vision to sort of take place. But it's a commendable initiative, and it's one of those initiatives which sort of provides an overall direction, and even I think investors, private sector will resonate with this overall strategy to move towards that, and the private sector could work towards this as the goalpost.
Now, the government also said that all government vehicles, they'll start with the government itself, that all government vehicles will be made electric or hybrid by 2025. What is your opinion on that as well?
So that, I think, is also another incremental step, because if you want to go by 2040, you have to start with the state, and there are a lot of vehicles that are even given to state officials and so on. So if they start at that point, and 2025, even though it's 8 years away, could creep on them quite quickly as well. So you need to start immediately, and government is maybe trying to show the first initiative towards that. But even for that to sort of take place, you need the foundation to be built. You need more electric charging stations. You need those being powered by non-fossil fuel.
Now, as in previous budgets, I'm guessing this budget as well, the government has drawn special attention on improving the agriculture, fisheries and IT sectors.
Yes, so those I think continue to be identified. So even on agri, more than the traditional type, there is more incentives given for tech-based agri to sort of, and technology being used to sort of improve harvest and things like that. IT, there has been a lot, both in terms of collaborating with local universities, creating funds so that they can access. Then SMEs also, there is a program where they could sort of access a lot of concessional loans, be part of, and get loans from banks without having to show collateral and things like that if you get into that program. So a lot of broad-based initiatives, which if you look complements the vision 2025 as well. But once again, these programs need to be sort of operationalized for the public to actually benefit from it.
We are coming to an interesting question now, Shiran. This proposal actually raised quite a couple of eyebrows. The price of beer apparently in the proposals is set to reduce. Well, some might say perfect, just in time for Christmas. What is your opinion on this?
So part of the idea, I think, with that is sort of to help boost for the tourism industry, because if you want to make that a vibrant industry and attract more foreigners and get them to sort of, I guess, enjoy Sri Lanka beyond the beaches and all the offerings we have, beer is something that generally the foreigners do enjoy. So my thinking my thinking or my perception of why this probably would have been reduced is to help promote the tourism industry.
Now, this proposal, of course, Shiran, has drawn widespread criticism from the opposing members of parliament, including some of the government members. As a matter of fact, even the Minister of Health himself was upset at the fact that this has been reduced. So how is the government going to tackle these problems? Are they going to go ahead despite all this criticism?
Well, if you look at it from an overall perspective, if they do sort of back down or backtrack, that might set a precedent. And other industries which are probably negatively impacted also might try to start lobbying for things like that as well, to sort of reverse what was said in the budget. So it's interesting if they do hold on to it. But I think given that it was an excise tax change, it's already been gazetted. So if I'm not mistaken, so a reversal of that might send a negative sentiment at this point, especially if it's just a few days after the budget.
Shiran, Finance Minister Mangala Samaravira actually justified the amendment on the price of beer, calling it because of the sugar content, saying it's safer to drink. It's a better option to drink beer rather than a cold drink, because a soft drink would have more sugar. So, and the health minister said the data he has is wrong. So is this the actual reason that the prices were reduced?
So I'm not an expert on the whole sugar composition, but I think as an overall principle, and that's something we've been highlighting even in the statement that we released, was these overnight changes, as it were, needs some sort of grace period or implementation time for the businesses to realize the impact of it. Because what we generally have is, with these changes, duty changes in particular, the excise gazette is done overnight and things change overnight. So if you're planning, if you had a 3-year plan, suddenly overnight these new regulations, even if it's a reduction in taxes and that's beneficial for you, these are quite volatile for businesses to sort of take place. So I think as a principle, I mean, even if the government itself is debating whether this is an viable option or not, they should maybe take that debate with the stakeholders concerned as well, and see, yes, we've announced it in the budget, but we are going to give you a grace period for this to be debated and to be implemented. So you avoid this whole, maybe a public debate on it, but allow businesses, allow the stakeholders to understand it, figure out if it's a viable option, viable tax option, and then go to implement it without trying to do it overnight. and run into all these difficulties that they generally do face in budgets.
Well, Shiran, let's talk about one of the confusing amendments, proposals rather, that they've made. They've introduced a tax for telecom towers. Could you elaborate on this, please?
So that is, I think, a tax of rupees 200,000 per month on cellular cellular towers, and there is, I think, about 5,500 towers that are there right now. So it's expected to bring in about a revenue of 13.2 billion. From the government side of things, I think the idea is for there to be visually it's a bit of a visual pollution or whatever you want to call it. So they want to sort of minimize that and call for sort of a consolidation within the towers. But from my understanding of the industry, I think these telecommunication companies do look for consolidation, or look to actually, if there's a tower, look to maybe build one together and things like that, because of the capex that go with it. So I think the tax as it is quite a lot for the industry. It'll capture a lot of their profits and tax a lot of their profits. So it needs to be thought through a bit more. And if the overall idea is to sort of consolidate and maybe reduce the number of taxes that are and reduce that pollution that we sort of see, then there are other methods that you can achieve it, rather than it just being a revenue target. So I think even on that proposal, further discussion maybe need to be had with the stakeholders to see how best they can implement it, if environment and the whole Blue Green initiative is the idea of the proposal.
Well, Shiran, we had to cross over another short commercial break. You're watching Biz First in Focus. We're talking about the 2018 budget presented in Parliament last week, and we're joined by Shiran Fernando, the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce Chief Economist. More coming your way on the other side of this commercial break. Welcome back to Biz First in Focus, and we are joined by Shiran Fernando, the Chief Economist at the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. We are discussing the important factors impacting Sri Lanka in the 2018 budget. Shiran, one of the proposals presented by the government was a special levy for debt repayment at the rate of 20 cents per 1,000 rupees on the total transactions made through banks.
So it's very similar to the proposal brought out last year as well, which was titled differently, called a financial transaction levy, and that was 5 rupees for every 10,000. So they've tried to reintroduce it once again, and this is for, or what they're sort of talking about is all transactions borne by financial institutions. So that's even banks, other financial companies, as well as even, I think, savings institutions such as the EPF and the like. So that's a big tax in that sense, and 20 billion is a lot, especially if you look at, even though the banks are quite profitable, they are going to go through more changes in the next few years as well, in terms of capital requirements, accounting changes. So you have to see it in that light. And the other side, I mean, if you look at it from the government perspective, they need additional revenue, and this is one more revenue mechanism or measure that they sort of want to get through. But if you look at, I mean, in the title of it, levy for debt repayment, $20 billion is about 130 million US dollars, which if you stack it up against our entire average debt repayment in the next few years, which probably is about 3.6 billion, is quite a fraction of it. So it's not necessarily going to service your debt and we're going to be fine because of it. It seems like, even if you look at this levy as well as if you look at the banking levy, it seems like sectors that have been doing well, been reporting, good profit or whatever, is sort of maybe looked at as the cash cows that sort of bring the revenue in. So I think the government needs to maybe look at this proposal quite carefully to see if they can introduce it in such a way that it doesn't really impact the banking sector as a whole and the financial sector as a whole without disrupting them, particularly given that they are also going to go through a bit of change in the next few years.
Shiran, also another proposal in this budget was they've reimposed a condominium tax. Now this tax was actually taken off, exempted in the previous budget.
Yeah.
So it has been reimposed.
So that's a bit of the contradiction that we're sort of seeing. I mean, a few places that we have seen, one is on this. So even on that, there is a bit of confusion because already. I mean, as you mentioned, when it was imposed, there is a bit of now input VAT sort of to be claimed and things like that. So that's going to cause a bit of confusion. So on that as well, you sort of maybe need to move to a point where you say, okay, from the 1st of April, every new apartment unit or something that is built from that point onwards, rather than it being maybe retrospective in that sense. So while overall the proposals are not of this nature, certain ones like these may need to look at before you sort of implement.
Shiran, at the beginning of the interview you spoke about government focusing attention on SMEs, but the budget also has given quite interesting bits. Let's talk about how much the government has drawn attention on small and medium scale enterprises.
So there is, especially if you look at it, SMEs in terms of their access to equity as well. There's talks about supporting about 50 agro and fishery companies. They've looked at women as well, 25 majority women companies, 150 youth-centric startups, and they're looking at the whole providing of equity into these companies and getting them to access what you sort of call the Enterprise Sri Lanka credit scheme. So there is a link. I mean, if you look at the programs that they've sort of put in place, for them to, because credit has been the issue for a lot of SMEs to develop. So if this sort of program does see the light of day, then these SMEs can develop and sort of make use of even export and develop the country further.
Shiran, over time, this government has constantly said it is a private sector who should take the opportunity. They always focus on the private sector. So does this budget contribute and support the private sector to contribute to Sri Lanka as well, to the economy rather?
So from an overall point of view, I think the signal is much better. So there is consistency for the private sector to sort of work with on a policy level. So that's something that the private sector can now look forward to. If you look at it in terms of a tax level, most of the tax changes have been done, especially the new Inland Revenue Act will become operationalized from the 1st of April. Other than these specific levies and taxes that have been introduced, most of the other things are as it is. So that operating ground, at least for 12 months, is sort of clear. And that should provide the impetus for the private sector to move forward with their investments, make use of things like GSP Plus, demand from countries sort of growing, and leverage on those things and sort of move forward. So the direction has been provided. Private sector must definitely make use of it in the next 12 months.
How has this changed the face of ease of doing business in Sri Lanka, the budget?
It hasn't changed it overnight. I think there are programs and task units and action plans that are looking specifically to improve our rating. But I think one specific thing is on enabling a single registration window for investments. So if something like that is sort of again implemented and operationalized, then our ratings will do much better. I mean, it's more than the ratings. I think we must also encourage our domestic investors also to help them, encourage them to even start up a business, set up something, export much easier. So even though while we're looking at foreign investors, we should also look after the domestic investors so that they also are more comfortable in promoting their business and opening up more ventures.
Shiran, the government has drawn up a plan which is titled Vision 2025. So does the 2018 budget, its proposals, are they in line with the Vision 2025 program?
It is. Most of the initiatives are, and I think they've sort of provided action points for some of the key items on it. So I think even future budgets will look to provide that. And if you do see some of these sort of getting worked out in the next year, I think that will give hope that Vision 2025 at least is moving and maybe moving towards being fulfilled.
Shiran, now we spoke about the Inland Revenue Act before. So will this particular act, the Inland Revenue Act, help reduce the budget deficit to 4.8% by the next year?
So they're, I think, expecting close to about 50 billion rupees to come in from this. I think it will. It'll need much more careful understanding and capture maybe more in the tax net as well. But I think it should, because it is sort of reduce some of the concessions, the tax holidays, or new tax holidays that would have been given under probably the old tax act. So it's sort of reducing the loopholes and the leakages, but even on that, I think the Inland Revenue Department will have to now implement it. Because of policy framework has been set in place, they would have to implement that with the systems that they have been using as well.
As we draw closer to wrapping up the program today, one of the important questions I want to ask at the outset, but better save the best for last. Now, you said some of the proposals from last year have been put onto this budget, and I also spoke about some of the proposals have not been implemented entirely. Only 3% are on track. So, keeping all of this in mind and these impressive proposals, how sure that these won't get repeated the next year? They could keep passing on from year to year to year.
So I think it will be not realistic for us to expect everything to be implemented. I think that's one thing that we have to be mindful of. The other thing is the budget is mainly a policy document. It's a policy framework. Yes, it sets out expenditures and things like that and allocations, but the ministries, the relevant ministries, have to go with it. So I think what will be quite useful next year is that if a similar study is done looking at expenditure proposals or revenue proposals on implementation, if we have improved on that, even more than 50% or even 60%, I think from where we are right now will be quite a good sign. And that will give hope that there is progress. And I expect it to be definitely much better than what the progress we've seen so far in 2017.
Well, thank you very much, Shiran, for joining us on the program this evening. That was Shiran Fernando, the Chief Economist at the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. We were talking about the 2018 budget, the good, the bad, and more importantly, its implementation. This has been Newsfirst in Focus. I'm Shayan Jarampati. Good night.